Okay, ask again.
Can anyone tell me what this image depicts? So
We paved over the earth.
I'll give you a hint.
Surface reflectivity.
The lighter colors indicate a higher value of a certain metric, and the darker colors indicate a lower value. Yes.
Is it iron?
No.
Not quite.
All right. So this. Anyways, this depicts chlorophyll concentration in the ocean. So the areas that are lighter have higher productivity, and the areas that are darker have lower productivity. And so chlorophyll concentration is a metric for how much phytoplankton are in the ocean. And phytoplankton are a huge part of the oceanic carbon cycle.
So why do phytoplankton matter, you ask? Well, phytoplankton are an important part of the oceanic ecosystem. They're one of the primary photosynthesizers in the ocean system, which means that they are taking in a lot of the energy in sunlight as well as a lot of carbon dioxide from the atmosphere. The phytoplankton provide food for most of the ocean's ecosystems, with the primary consumers eating them, and then it works its way up to trophic levels with the carbon dioxide and organic carbon being consumed by subsequent trophic levels, eventually remaining in the ocean ecosystem or being respirated back into the ocean.
So this shows with the dark areas, those are areas where phytoplankton productivity are low, and that means that there is a capacity in those areas to increase phytoplankton productivity, thereby increasing carbon sequestration into the ocean. So as phytoplankton productivity increases, the whole ecosystem becomes more productive. That translates to more carbon being sequestered in marine life, and then eventually making its way to the bottom of the ocean, being covered by sediments, and being sequestered there for a really long time.
The only thing we're missing is a nutrient. So if only there was a way that we can add more nutrients into the ocean to further enhance this system. Well, there is, with ocean fertilization through iron. So before we touch on how this is actually going to work, I'm going to quickly review the phytoplankton and the carbon cycle. And we're having some weird glitch with the bottom screens here, so ignore that, I guess. So up here we have atmospheric CO2, and that enters the ocean system during the photosynthesis when the phytoplankton are taking in CO2 and sunlight, and then when they die, that CO2 remains in the ocean, but also there's consumers that eat the phytoplankton and respirate carbon dioxide, as well as dying and sinking to the bottom of the ocean or low into the ocean where the carbon remains. A small portion of the carbon re-enters the atmosphere through respiration, but the main point here is that the net outcome of this system is that carbon remains in the oceans. So here's how it works with fertilization. So here's the system as it stands. So we send boats out, and they fertilize the system.
And so they fertilize the system, which causes an increase in phytoplankton, which causes an increase in some of these other marine life. So essentially that increase in phytoplankton feeds the whole food web, causing increased productivity across the board, and then increasing the amount of CO2 sequestered in the bottom of the ocean. So currently the atmospheric carbon pool is about 600 gigatons of carbon, and we increase that by 4 gigatons per year from anthropogenic sources. And so with iron fertilization, it is possible to sequester more of the atmospheric CO2, which is having a very large effect on climate change, to move that to be sequestered in the bottom of the ocean, where it will remain for thousands of years and will not affect our global climate systems.
All right, so we have a timeline that's going to show how the infrastructure, the policy, and the costs of this sort of project would look over the next couple of years. Our overall plan is to use iron fertilization, which requires really low infrastructure investments. So that's a really unique component of this project, is that the infrastructure rarely has to be renewed. And additionally, the costs are pretty low overall, and then they maintain like the same cost over time. So it's not like a super high investment, which is really unique to this as well. And our goal is to stabilize the atmospheric CO2 at 400 parts per million. And we're going to prepare to ramp up iron fertilization by 2050 by doubling our efforts, which will cause the atmospheric CO2 to decrease to 350 parts per million by 2065. So I'll begin outlining what that's going to look like over time. We'll begin with infrastructure. The ships, like basically what we're going to have is a cap and trade system for iron fertilization. And before I go more in detail about the timeline, I'm going to have August describe a little bit more about how a cap and trade system works.
So cap and trade, or emissions trading, is a system that states impose onto the market, which creates an artificial market mechanism where there are caps on what private firms can emit, and they can trade with other firms to meet their caps, other firms that are emitting lower amounts. This also encourages firms to invest in sequestration measures because firms that are emitting lots of CO2 can pay these companies to offset the amount that they're emitting, and that's essentially largely what we're encouraging here.
So perfect. So the ships, like the cap and trade system that we're outlining, is going to create an incentive for private companies to invest in ship infrastructure. That's not even something that we're necessarily going to factor into our costs overall. Instead, we're going to mainly focus on like maintaining the iron sulfate so that we can have that, so that it can go into the ocean. And the main way that we're going to acquire iron sulfate is because it's a like byproduct of steel production, and then also finding locations where there's a lot of iron ore, so that we're able to have like large amounts of it, so that we're really targeting areas where this is like naturally plentiful. And then for a project like this that has sort of like economic implications as well as environmental implications, having policy that's really like intentionally placed is important. So we're going to be going through some international policy as well as domestic policy from a U.S. point of view, just to highlight that each individual nation will need to be utilizing their own sort of domestic policy as well. So starting out in 2020 for international policy, for cap and trade countries that already utilize a cap and trade system, such as Australia or New Zealand or major cities in China, even South Korea and India, we're going to be incorporating iron fertilization into their cap and trade. So corporations and emitters can offset their emissions by buying up these fertilization points, and by investing in government iron fertilization operations, they can offset their carbon emissions. And then for non-cap and trade countries, such as the United States, we want to incorporate fertilization into the Clean Water and Air Act and allow like that to be pumped more iron into the water. And then the cost of the bottom, you can't necessarily see, but Hannah's going to cover it. And the great thing with the cost is that it stays the same. So even though our screen's blacking out, you're really not missing that much.
So how much will this cost every year? So in this model, starting in 2020, we're going to add enough iron into the ocean to balance that 4 gigatons per year that is coming from anthropogenic pollution. So that's how we're staying at 400 parts per million until 2050. So how much does that cost? The amount of iron we need is 0.2% of the amount of iron produced in the whole world every year. So that is a very, very, very small input. And it will cost about $87 million every year. But that's the total cost. And so this cost is the cost of buying industrial iron sulfate, but because, like Talia said, iron sulfate is actually a byproduct of the steelmaking industry, this cost is probably an artificially inflated estimate, because it will most likely be less expensive to take advantage of that byproduct, and steel is one of the most common resources that we create, so there's a lot of iron sulfate that is a byproduct of that industry.
Perfect. So moving along to 2025, we're just going to put in this really fun image of a ship to represent infrastructure, and then we'll move along to the policy. So for international policy, we're going to propose a replacement for the guidelines proposed in the original 1972 Convention on the Prevention of Marine Pollution by Dumping Waters and Other Matter at the UN Convention on the Law of the Sea, which is the real long official title. And the original agreement established international regulations for dumping waste at sea, but this new proposed amendment would classify iron as like a general output rather than as waste, so that iron fertilization wouldn't be constituted as a pollutant, and thus could serve as a platform for being traded in this cap and trade system that we're proposing. And then domestically, we want to draft an amendment to the Marine Protection, Research, and Sanctuaries Act that provides tax incentives for corporations that support cap and trade and incentivize or require site management and monitoring plans, which currently in the U.S. are created by the EPA and are regulated through the EPA. And having these be like specifically related to iron would help us to like understand what's going on, not only domestically but globally. And then that's just like a dollar sign down there, so like you're really not missing anything. And then as we move on to 2030, again, we're gonna have a fun picture of a ship. And then for the policy, we want to create a new specialized UN agency incorporating responsibilities from the United Nations Environment Program and the United Nations Conference on Trade and Development to reinforce and manage cap and trade, because there wouldn't be any sort of UN branch right now that would specifically look at both sort of the economic and environmental imperatives that we're discussing currently. And then we'll have the fun like dollar sign again to just symbolize continuity as we go to 2035. And the policy for 2035 is really to target...
There's no ship evolution?
No, like it would be cool, and like maybe in the future we'll have like a fun like ship picture, but I just think, you know, like, the same ship really never gets old, so
Okay.
you can see it 2 more times, which is equally as exciting. But for the international policy in 2035, we're going to target the top iron-producing countries and ensure that they've, you know, reached a specific level of iron production, and just like ensure that they've met the regulations that we've outlined through other international policy. And you can see those countries up there. And then as we move along to 2040,
You might try to reload. I can tell you what's going on here very briefly.
yeah.
Windows is trying to understand what kind of image it's looking at, and it doesn't understand it. So it's trying to sort of update in real time. So you can see the bottom come and go. It's never going to load properly.
Well, you know,
It's not your fault at all, but it's a very good attempt, by the way, to try this format. But this is what happens when you are going to use documents like Google Docs or a spreadsheet or something like that.
yeah.
Because the basic idea is you're splitting the visualization over 3 different video cards, and it's got to carve up all that pixel real estate with respect to your document. This is why a single image is always, at the moment, is the best way to do this, but it's too limiting. So one of the reasons I'm doing this is I want to expose some technical failures so I can show them to the library people on my YouTube channel. You know, this is real. We have real students doing this. This is, you know, she's a real student.
They're looking concerned out there.
So.
Yeah,
I think we're really hitting home.
So on the slightly unrelated note, going back to domestic policy, in 20, we are going to
Good recovery.
we're going to draft an amendment to the Marine Protection, Research, and Sanctuaries Act that would incentivize site management and monitoring plans for targeted areas where fertilization would be beneficial globally. And then in 2045, here comes the boat. In 2045, for international policy, we're going to utilize the positive economic and environmental impacts shown through domestic monitoring plans to encourage international businesses to create site management plans and to encourage small businesses to become involved in the process by providing them with grant opportunities through environmental loans available in their varying countries, and through an international grant pool that will be available to international trade businesses through the UN specialized agency we're promoting. Additionally, we're going to publish a 25-year report on cap and trade because it will have been 25 years, which is thrilling. And we're going to propose an amendment to the Kyoto Patrol, which would be ratified by the U.S. And Canada and other countries that failed to ratify or withdrew from the original agreement and incorporate iron fertilization into that original document. And then finally, in 2050, the policy after the vote is to utilize the unique ability to regulate carbon emissions without needing additional infrastructure and produce some sort of long-term campaign focused on reducing carbon emissions and providing future support for iron fertilization, just so that legislation will be intact, that won't necessarily be able to be disturbed with, so that like the process of this sort of system can be more long-term.
Okay, so when we're looking at our ocean fertilization plan and comparing to other geoengineering projects out there already, we can already see many disparities in how they actually don't mitigate the effects of CO2 and how they actually would not be the most beneficial geoengineering products. We highlighted 3 main geoengineering products that are being touched on today and talked to about this committee. The first one is carbon sequestration. So the main issue with carbon sequestration is leaking. We see a lot of leakage throughout the world where there's small projects of carbon sequestration already happening. Not only leakage once they inject it within the ground, but also the transportation and the storage of such before they do inject the carbon into the ground. In Italy, there was shown a study that almost over 250 people died in a certain small town because of carbon sequestration leaking. And leaking from the ground at a rate of 1% over 100 years would actually cause a 2-degree Celsius increase, which is not mitigating anything. Another large one is the research that we don't have on carbon sequestration currently. We don't know how much these carbon sequestration plans are going to be spaced out. We don't know the monitoring laws that are going to be necessary to keep these things intact. Are you pointing out? Okay, you're saying you're going to talk about it. Well, I'm just pointing out you don't have that info. In your institutional, you have to institute a lot of change within the international laws, which isn't already happening, which is quite concerning, especially within relations to carbon sequestration laws. We also don't know the geographical response to carbon injection within the ground. We don't know the fracture dilation causes, the fault reaction to this, or the reservoir dilation as well. There's no research being done on that. And going off of the research, the lack of research, this is going to cost a lot of money to do this research, long-term research that's actually going to produce results on how well this carbon sequestration can actually work. And we're going upwards of $225 million over 7 years for researching carbon sequestration. Also, monitoring costs are going to be a lot of money. Who's going to monitor it? Well, countries are going to do so, and the relations with that. And then?
Okay, so addressing problems with the atmospheric shield geoengineering idea is the amount of precipitation that's going to occur globally is going to actually decrease by estimates say between 5 and 13% depending on the region, which will lead to agricultural problems in regions where they really need to catch a break as far as agriculture goes and keeping their economy going. Also, aerosols sprayed into the atmosphere will actually deplete the ozone, meaning that if there was a malfunction or for some reason we stopped spraying because it is a continuous process, there would be a rapid rate of warming on the surface of the Earth, approximately 1 to 4 degrees centigrade per decade for 10 to 20 years, which is, like right now, we're going at a much slower rate, so we're going to make a huge jump there. Again, so we're creating like a dependency on this that we can't get away from. And then lastly, even though you all did a very nice job telling us why acid rain is really not that bad, it's pretty bad. It's dangerous to ecosystems and to species, and it isn't a side effect that we're willing to accept for a temporary solution to a long-term problem. And then moving on to some issues with surface reflectivity. Again, it's going to create a much drier climate. Like I said, 13.4% in tropical regions. And it's a really unique and fragile ecosystem that we don't have the right, first of all, and then we don't to tamper with, and then we don't know like
what would happen if we did tamper with that too much. Also, weather pattern changes is going to be a huge problem with surface reflectivity. Monsoons are driven by the differential of land and ocean temperatures, and as we increase the surface reflectivity, that differential will decrease, which will make it so the monsoon severity and season length will become smaller, creating water rights issues as there's less rainfall and, again, agricultural problems. And then lastly, the example of using the Amazon as a city, like clear cutting the Amazon, is actually a really bad idea because the Amazon rainforest is a huge carbon sink. So clear cutting of the Amazon will release tons of carbon into the atmosphere, and then eliminating a way for us to naturally sequester the carbon back from the atmosphere. So again, it's really, we don't want to do that. We want to keep what we have naturally here and then be able to move forward with our fermentation.
Yeah, and within each of these that Indigo and I talked about, each of these projects themselves are going to cost a lot of money in infrastructure, when in reality ocean fertilization doesn't cost that much money at all, as shown through our timeline. And each of these is going to require a lot more research in regards to just actually implementation. So these are actually going to be slowing the process down of solving the issue, each of these.
So, in conclusion, iron fertilization is not costly, it does not require many infrastructure inputs, and we can start it now. So we can stabilize at 406 parts per million where we are today. We won't continue to increase our atmospheric CO2, and then by 2050 we'll start to decrease it. So unlike any of these other schemes, this doesn't change, that don't change how much carbon is sequestered in the atmosphere. This is a really quick and long-lasting fix. So we think that iron fertilization is definitely the best approach for the IPCC to take to mitigate climate change. It's not costly, and it is something that we can start on now.
Thank you.